thank you, Dr. Best, for introducing our asthma work that we've done collaboratively. As said, I'm Rael Leary. I'm a coordinator at the Eagle View office. The Breathe asthma study that was mentioned. The Breathe asthma study that was mentioned was the first research study that I had the opportunity to work on with Missouri Breaks. And from there, my career was just kind of spun into a whirlwind of fun and research and public health. And I'll share some of kind of how I got started with the smoke-free work that I've done on the Cheyenne River Sioux Reservation. Okay, good. So, what next slide here? So this one is. Do you have some ideas for me?
Yep.
Thank you. So what we'll talk about is a review of the smoke-free community initiatives of the Cheyenne River Sioux Tribe with the Chunley Coalition, as well as the Promoting Smoke-Free Homes in Lakota Community study that was conducted more recently. Next slide, please. So kind of an overview of the Chunley Coalition. As I said, I began with the Breathe asthma research in 2007. And about 2009, the state of South Dakota was going through a battle to get the state smoke-free public places in the ban. It went to a public vote in 2010. That was passed. It occurred to me that because of tribal sovereignty, which is intended to protect the health and welfare of all tribal communities, that state policy would not be enforceable on the reservations, including Cheyenne River, where I was living. So I had this concern. I went to Marcia and was really fired up about this. What are we going to do? And she said, well, what are you going to do about it? So that was kind of the start of the Chunley Coalition. Myself and about 5 others from Cheyenne River got together and all shared a passion for wanting to advocate for a smoke-free policy for the reservation. To our knowledge, we're the 4th in the nation to have a comprehensive smoke-free air policy out of the 574 federally recognized tribes. So there's a long way to go yet. And we're still the only one in South Dakota. That happened in 2015 with support from Public Health Law Center, as well as other several grants that funded our work and our advocacy. It took 6 years. We are a reservation with a 51% smoking rate among our adult population. So you can just imagine that, that if that 51% is a representative sample of our tribal council representatives, it's going to be hard to get a majority vote to ban smoking in indoor public places. So it took 6 years. It was quite a battle. We went through multiple meetings and recruited a wide array of coalition members. Did a lot of community education, several media efforts to recognize the businesses that went smoke-free on their own, several legal reviews, which is a process if you know the tribal government, and up to 12 presentations to the Tribal Health Committee before we ultimately were successful in our mission to make the reservation smoke-free. Next slide, please. So this just kind of shows I guess the momentum that was necessary to get this big comprehensive smoke-free policy passed. In those 6 years that we were advocating up to 2015, we didn't just say, when they said, no, we don't really like this, we kind of like to smoke in our council chambers still. We went to other areas. We worked on smoke-free parks. We worked with the hotel to implement a a smoking fine. The Lakota Cultural Center at the time was selling commercial tobacco for ceremonial purposes, so we got them to change their practices with that. One of our longtime coalition members, who's passed on now, Hazel Redbird, came to a meeting one day and she told us the story that she was getting her dentures refitted at the local dentist and through IHS, and he pulled this thing that looked like a cigarette out of his pocket and was puffing on it as he consulted with her. And she said, what is that? She can't smoke in there. She was just beside herself. I said, well, it sounds like a vape. So we went to Indian Health Service then and worked with them to add electronic cigarettes to their smoking policy as well. So a lot of work that went into kind of building up to that vape policy in 2015. And then you can see after that, the work continued with smoke-free powwows and rodeo grounds, smoke-free apartments on the reservation. more parks and enhanced school policies as well that also distinguish the difference between commercial tobacco and traditional tobacco, which is chinchasha. And of course, the addition of vapes, because those were not a thing at the time that many of the schools had passed their smoking policies. Next slide, please. So when we had success on Cheyenne River implementing a comprehensive smoke-free air policy in 2015, we had a number of tribes within South Dakota as well as outside of South Dakota call and say, how do we do this? We want this for our community. So at that point, we made an attempt to do a process evaluation of the work that went into all the work to get the policy passed, and kind of came up with some themes that included education, community engagement, and policy. And then we did our best to quantify those efforts, and that's the graph that you see here. You can see that the community engagement was kind of a steady increase until the policy passed, and the others were as well. And of course, we've continued all of this work because once the policy's passed, the work's not done, right? That's just the beginning then of enforcement, which has been an ongoing endeavor that we continue to take on. So that is the process evaluation that then, next slide please, kind of turned into this framework. And this is intended to be an iterative process. There's no beginning or end to our framework. But what we realized when we sifted through years of grants and reports and activities is that in order to make success in public health work in tribal communities, that includes education and it includes policy. But in between those two sections is this community engagement piece. We can't do policy without community engagement, and we can't do education without community engagement. So that's kind of that overlaying section of the circles there. And the other big important thing to this is the cultural lifeways. That this isn't something that we can go guide for policy advocacy and make it work in our community. We have to incorporate all of the cultural lifeways of our community so it feels local and it feels like something that they can resonate with, not something that was designed in Washington, D.C. or New York or somewhere else. So this is kind of the framework that resulted. And then from here, this turned into a toolkit that is on the website. And it's unfortunate we can't see the bottom of the screen, but if you all want to take it down, it's just findyourpowersd.com. And if you go to that website, you can gain access to our toolkit in the top right corner. And each of these white words is a clickable link that will take you to a separate page and give you a full planning steps, resources necessary, budget items, examples of the Chumley Coalition, and there's tons of resources in there. We are all about sharing. We don't want to sit on the golden nuggets that have worked for us. We want to share that with everybody. There's model policies in there. So it's just a lot of resources that we hope that everybody uses in their own communities. And I will also note that this framework was designed on our tobacco work, but this is something that can be carried over into drug prevention or breastfeeding promotion or really anything related to public health. Next slide, please. So once we had success with the smoke-free community policy, we had an opportunity to partner with Dr. Patricia Ness Henderson from the Black Hills Center for American Indian Health. And I led a team at Missouri Breaks on Cheyenne River that consisted of Karen Little Wounded and Tracy Long Soldier, who continue to work at Missouri Breaks. And community policy is one piece of it, but we're seeing a lot of people that were smoking in their homes. And that's something that needed addressed because that's where a lot of our kids and our elders spend most of their time. We know again that about half of our population smokes commercial tobacco, and that non-smokers, especially children, are disproportionately affected by the impact of indoor secondhand smoke. And then there's this really complicated relationship that a lot of our community has with commercial tobacco and traditional tobacco. Because commercial tobacco, chinchasha, is very scarce, it's hard to get. it's just easier sometimes to go to the gas station and pick up a pack of Natural American Spirits or Red Man or whatever it is. So unfortunately, we see a lot of that in our community, and that contributes then to the exposure to commercial tobacco that many of our community members are exposed to. Next slide, please. So the aims of our study were to assess the knowledge, attitudes, and beliefs about secondhand smoke exposure, as well as the perceived barriers to the adoption of smoking restrictions in homes. We used a participatory approach to translate the qualitative findings from some key informant interviews that we did to achieve aim 1, and created some intervention materials then that we evaluated, and that included urinary cotinine and carcinogenic biomarker feedback, where our participants who were the non-smokers in the home gave us a urine sample, and we then gave the results to some of them to see if that would convince them maybe to advocate for a change in their home. Next slide, please. And I just wanted to mention, kind of back to the earlier presentations this morning, and the rigor and the length and the work that goes into, creating an RFA for a grant application that then those of us in tribal communities, as well as our partners, apply for. It's a long process once that funding happens. So you can see that back in 2016, that's when the idea happened, and this was applied for. And then in 2017, the study began. Of course, it takes several months to get through the approval process. And the subaward was given to Missouri Bricks to carry this study out. In March 2018, we did the key informant interviews with 12 community members, and then began the creation of those intervention materials. Then, of course, the recruitment and enrollment phase, which was about a year and a half. We enrolled 162 participants. Our initial goal was 138, but we had such great interest in this study that we reached our initial recruitment goal very quickly, and we're able to then expand to a larger group of participants. Then in 2020, we started the data cleaning and process, and now analysis and publications are still ongoing here in 2022. So you can just see kind of the length that a lot of these studies go through to get to this point. And then we don't have approval at this point to share the results of the randomized control trial of our intervention, but I can share with the next slide the results of the key informant interviews that might be interesting to you all. You see the top there, but the motivations for smoke-free homes from those interviews, what we learned is that children are a big motivator for families to make that change. And then we also saw kind of the theme of a lot of our Lakota values coming through in the conversations in these interviews. So you can see on the right-hand side, there's some of the Lakota values that apply to these themes. Another motivator was health, not only for themselves, but for their family members. Their spirituality was a motivator, utilizing Lakota spirituality as motivation to create that healthy environment. And generational smoking actually was something interesting that we hadn't anticipated. And that's, addressing multiple generations in the family who smoke in the household. So it's not just, maybe a spouse, but maybe it's grandma or auntie or the adult children that are also living in the home. That has to be kind of a whole household change that everybody is willing to get on board with. Next slide, please. Another theme from our key informant interviews is the strategies for making a person's home smoke-free, and what worked for those 12 individuals that did this on their own. The criteria to participate in this was having been smoke-free in their home for 5 years. So these are families from the community that did this, on their own and maintained it for several years that we were able to learn a lot from. They found that changing their environment, simple things like not having an ashtray in their home anymore, made a big difference. Communication, just making sure that everybody knows this is the new rule and it's expected to be followed. And that can either be through individual conversations or signs. A lot of them had like homemade signs on their door or on the fridge, things like that. The social struggle, of course, there's always interesting family dynamics that come into play with this, because the smokers are addicted to a very addictive substance. So it's a hard thing to make that change. But that is something that needs considered. And we also found that the smoke-free home changes kind of were different for different genders and ages. And then child advocates was really interesting. A lot of the came from interview participants shared stories about a child in the home that said, I don't like the way I feel when you smoke around me, or they learned something at school that they brought home and then said, did you know that there's 7,000 chemicals in that? So some of those personal stories where if a young person in their life is advocating for themselves and their health, it's a lot harder to say no to that sacred child. Next slide, please. And then ceremonial practices was another theme that emerged from the interviews. Like I said, the difference between the chinchasha, the traditional tobacco, and the chanli, which is the commercial tobacco. Just kind of understanding the differences is important within the Lakota culture. And then elder stories were mentioned pretty frequently, and talking about connecting to those ceremonial practices, their culture, and teachings about the role of chinchasha was helpful to many of the households. Next slide. So from that, what we learned with our key program interviews then, we took a 5-step model to make your home smoke-free and modified it. And we incorporated the Lakota values. You can see on the left-hand side there, some examples is having compassion for my family and friends to stay healthy, honor and respect the home of my family and children, educate the truth about the dangers of secondhand smoke to my family. So we learned, or we used some of those Lakota values in the materials that we then developed, and I feel like our participants really responded well to those. This actually was a placemat, a laminated placemat that they could put at their table, and it kind of served as a talking point then for maybe your relative comes to have coffee and they see this placemat, and, oh, what's this about? And then it initiates that conversation where they can say, oh, we made our home smoke-free a few weeks ago, and here's how it's going, and here's our reasons, or make it a talking point. And then, of course, the benefits, as well as some quit line information. We found that a lot of our participants came back and said, well, whoever the smoker is in the house, they want to quit. What can you share with us to support them in their quit attempt? And then this is another one. This is a snip from the biomarker feedback that each of the participants received. Again, we use the Lakota values in sharing their biomarker feedback. So when they found out what their levels were for the NNAL, which is a carcinogen in their urine that comes from secondhand smoke exposure, as well as their cotinine level, meaning how much nicotine their body metabolized from that secondhand smoke exposure, how to use that in a good way with their family member that's smoking and saying, look, here's what I found out from this study. I have high levels of nicotine in my body, as well as this cancer-causing chemical. This is something we can talk about changing. So that was kind of the advocacy tools that we gave our participants to use. As far as participation, this goes through kind of the structure. So at the baseline visit, that was just the consent, the survey, the urine collection. We had them hang a dosimeter in their home, which collected the presence of nicotine in the home. 8 weeks later, we then had them come back and get their results of their urine if they were in the intervention group. And then 11 weeks later, we came back and we just kind of revisited the intervention materials and said, how did that go for you? What were the discussions like in your household? Is there something more we can support you with? Did you get your sign hung up in your home? Revisited those 5 steps to see where their progress was and kind of troubleshoot if they had any issues in that discussion with their family. And then 6 months later, they did a repeat dosimeter in their home for a week to collect nicotine. And at that time, the control group received their urine results. So everybody got the intervention at that 8-week visit, but the intervention group also got their urine results versus the control group that didn't get it till the end. We did maintain a 92% retention rate, which we're very proud of. And the next slide, you can see, this is, Lyle mentioned a Red Talk video from the asthma study that you can check out, and that is the link to Red Talks. We also have a series of videos that we produced from the smoke-free home study. One of them is explaining the 5 steps to making your home smoke-free. Another is a comic book that we gave to families that shows kind of a story of a young man who uses his code of values and advocacy to help his family decide to make his home smoke-free. And then this third and fourth videos here are from 2 participants who had great experiences with our study and were willing to share their study on video or their experience on video with the process of making their home smoke-free and what worked for them. Next slide shows, this is actually soon to be a page on our, you remember the framework that I showed in the close to the beginning. This is going to be a page now. We'll have a whole section on making your home smoke-free that is undergoing higher approval. And with that, stay tuned for more results from the actual randomized control trial. We hope to have that published very soon.
Thank you, Dr. Baston-Ray. Any questions from the audience as we transition to the next speaker?
I see one, go ahead. Yes, I'd be happy to. Commercial tobacco is highly addictive. It has up to 7,000 chemicals. It's not natural. It is harmful both to the user as well as anybody else who's using it around them. But traditional tobacco is actually, for the Lakota people, a red willow plant. And what they do is take this bright red peel, I guess, off of the bark, and then shave the bark inside of that. And then it is used in ceremonies, for offerings, for prayers. It can be used in the chalupa or the pipe, but it's not meant to be inhaled. There's no additives. It's not harmful to the health. It is all natural. And because there's similarities between the uses, unfortunately, a lot of times they get used interchangeably. But one of our missions with the Chimney Coalition is to advocate for the use of chinchasha instead of that harmful commercial tobacco. Very good question.